today. If I haven't had a chance to meet you yet, my name is Kyla Pools, and I'm the Heritage Program Coordinator for Patapsco Heritage Greenway. Thank you again for joining us for our final talk of our 2023 Patapsco Day celebration. This year, our theme is Patapsco Stories, which is a concentrated effort to explore the various resources, places, and materials that help us understand and illustrate the diverse stories and experiences of the Patapsco Valley Heritage area. So joining us today, we have Ned Tillman. Ned is the author of 4 books, a keynote speaker, and the creative force behind the Saving the Places We Love campaign. He has published 2 nonfiction books full of ideas and examples of what it takes to accomplish these goals, entitled The Chesapeake Watershed and Saving the Places We Love, as well as 2 novels to inspire each of us to take action now, called The Big Melt and, most recently, A Good Endeavour. During his career, Ned provided energy and environmental consulting services to governments and corporations across the U.S. and abroad. He has presented keynote addresses at national conventions, colleges, and for a range of businesses and nonprofit organizations. He serves on local, regional, and national boards, working to ensure the health and sustainability of our country. All proceeds from his books go towards watershed restoration, climate, and land preservation efforts. Today, Ned will be speaking about his process of exploring, honoring, and preserving the past as a foundation for future generations as they face the challenges of their era. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Ned Tillman.
Thank you very much, Kyla, and it's great to see you all. I don't know everybody here, but it's a nice group of people I've seen before. How many of you belong to PHG? Okay. What was that, about half? So, it's a pretty interesting organization. It's been around a number of years, but they really got involved with, in a much bigger way in the last 5 or 10 years, by getting involved with the heritage programs in the state of Maryland. So they've been funded to do a lot more work than they did in the past. So if you care about the Patapsco River, that's probably one of the main places to go to get more involved. I did a project for them during this same program a few years ago, and it was a hike. They asked me to hike around Ellicott City. And to my surprise, about 150 people showed up.
Quite proud.
I don't know if you've been on any of my hikes, but nice number is about 15 or 20. Because you want to see everything and bend over and look at it and talk about it. Well, with 150 people, it turned out to be, like 4 different lectures throughout the town. It was a lot of fun. It was the 3 R's, right? The railroads, the river, and rocks. There's a lot of history in all those. It was a fun day to do that. So I've been asked to talk about, I was asked to talk about anything I wanted to talk about, as I remember. And so I had to really try to guess who was coming tonight and what to say that wasn't repetitive. And I think you'll see this is a pretty fresh presentation. Why do we get involved with the Patapsco River? Because it's beautiful, right? It's a wonderful escape. It lets you get out of the house, right? It lets you go for a walk. You know the paths are going to be there the next day. So it's really why I fell in love with Patapsco. And especially in the last 3 or 4 years. I ended up doing a lot more hiking than I did before because I didn't want to meet and talk with any of you guys, right? I want to be out in the woods. So it was a good way to get through that period of time. But it also gave me the opportunity to try something different, which we'll get to. So, yes, I'm a geologist, I'm an earth scientist, I'm an environmental scientist, and I've done a lot of work. Uh-oh, is that your timer or my timer?
Oh, no, sorry, that was
I just fixed the timer on my laptop and not using it, so.
Go ahead.
So yes, so that's why I got involved initially. Some 3,000 walks later, I walked the roads, the paths, the rivers in Howard County a lot. I've come to a new appreciation for it. It's not just the beauty. It's not just the ecology or the geology. It's not just getting outside. But it's a deeper appreciation for what man's impact has been over the last 300, 400 years. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And it's something I've struggled with personally, is how to deal with some of those history aspects in this area. And the best thing I could do was go out and make myself as knowledgeable as possible about the history of this area. So, this is a gorgeous picture, right? Anybody recognize it? Yeah, it's the falls at McKeldin. And the first time I walked along it, I don't know if I was with Max or not. We keep fighting about who discovered this, but you know, this looks very natural, doesn't it? Or this is a man-made cut to reroute the river so the railroad could go straighter through that area. And that happens in a lot of parts of the Patapsco. So there's been this interaction between nature and man and our dreams of what we want to do. Next slide, please. Yes, that's my smiling face, because I'm out there enjoying myself, walking along the Patapsco River and spotting lichen along the side on one of the rocks. Always been amazed by lichen. And I've learned recently that lichen is not just a mix of one fungal group with an algae, but there's multiple algae. I'm just trying to figure out why are some pistachio colored and some are orange colored? You know, it's not the fact that I know the answer to that, but it's the fact that I like to ask that kind of question. Because that curiosity will get you a long ways on the planet. And I get to give talks to seniors and high school kids, and that's one of the things I always talk about is, it's not so much as the final thing that you accomplish, it's asking the right question at the beginning. And that's hard for many of us to do. Okay, so introduction. Yeah, I think I gave you my introduction. My passion is to get outside, engage with people, maybe share some knowledge, and then maybe even inspire them to care about where we live. Really, it's great when somebody comes up to me and says, Ned, I read your first book and I went out and bought a kayak. I think, good, that's the first step, get outside. And the second step is to fall in love with being outside. What do you think the third step is? What PhD does, you know, it's take care of the outside so that our children and their children can enjoy it. You know what happens to me sometimes is I'll be in front of a group of people, and there are people who are like younger than I am, hard to believe, right? There are people in their 20s or in their teens, and they'll stand up and say, Ned, you and your generation have destroyed this planet. You ruined it for us. What are you passing on, this legacy of fear and death? Well, you know, guess what? I understand that. I used to be that kid. You know, back in the 50s and 60s, it looked like a pretty bleak future, too. In the early 60s with all the nuclear threats. Hey, and then in the late 60s, a lot of troubles. We certainly had a lot of troubles in our cities, and we started to learn about all the troubles we had with environmental dumps and wastes and things like that. And we had a lot of civil rights tension trying to work on these. And it turns out these issues have pretty much always been there. They just look different as we go along. And so what I wanted to find out in the last 3 years is researching down into the past and understanding, not to judge people so much, but to understand what we did and what we may continue to do with our Earth and with our fellow travelers. Okay, so status and the use of literature. I'm getting kind of old, you know, and sometime I'm not going to get up here and give these talks. So I want to leave something that inspires others. And so I've really been working on this collection of books that hopefully are attractive to people of different ages. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit at the end. But I really think that literature, both nonfiction and fiction, have big roles to play to educate and inspire us to take care of the planet better. Always have to put Emerson's quote up. You only see what you expect to see. 2 weeks ago, I was in Tucson. It was colder there than here. Went down to see some, what kind of cranes were they? Sandhill cranes. They were not there, but my favorite bird was there waiting for me. It was a vermilion flycatcher. And I've only seen him a couple of times in my life, but you know, I would not have seen that bird if I hadn't told myself, let's go look for one. So I like to encourage people always to think before they go out in the woods. to search. Okay, we can move on. I'm glad some of you are laughing. I was hoping nobody would be, oh, he's looking at me. So here's the question I have you. I've been asking myself this the last few weeks. You know, we change throughout our life. You know, we're different stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. When we're young, you know, maybe you were a football player, or maybe you were a trumpet player, then you became a professional, and then pandemic hits you, or your kids leave, or something, and you start creating a new persona in many cases. And so I'm really curious about how this goes in the future. Is if we all take time, hopefully things are at a calm, with the pandemic anyhow, at a calm place or stage. But just to think, you know, who am I now after that? That was some experience. Did it change me in any way? I know who I am. I'm all those things I used to be, but I think I'm even a little bit more committed now to really support the social fabric that makes things better. And again, I have to hand it to all the organizations around, especially GHE, who seem to be doing that as their mission. And I can join them, or you can join them, or any of the other ones, to see who you might be in the future. And the second question, why are you here? Some of you I know, and I'm surprised you're here. Right? No, it's just, why are you here? Is it to be entertained? Is it to learn something new? Or is it to think about your place on the planet? It's like, you know, we could get to think about those sorts of things. And I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're all here. So let's go to the next slide. I always like to have a talk where I know where I am. And where am I actually at the moment? What watershed am I in? Am I in the Patapsco or the Patuxent? Anybody know that? Patuxent? Okay. Just thinking, very close to here, runs down into Ellicott City.
Right.
So, good question. You know, maybe we should, I'll find that out. Come to my next talk, I'll have that answer. Okay, so the watersheds. It's interesting, especially the names of the watersheds here in the western side of the bay. Patapsco, Susquehanna, Patuxent, Potomac, Pocomoke. Doesn't it kind of suggest something? Like we're not the first people here? We adopt all those names and then forget about the significance of those people. Even gunpowder, I think, is named by the Native Americans because they, along the Gunpowder River, would plant gunpowder thinking it might grow. Interesting perspective. I don't think they did it very long. But I've highlighted those two up here because that's kind of what we want to talk about tonight. We want to talk about the Patapsco River and its sister river on the other side of Baltimore. The two rivers kind of are a greenway around the city. And we were focused here on the Patapsco. But I think we learn a lot more when we have something to compare it with. You know, is it unique? Are all the city rivers the same? We'll find out. And this map is a contact archaeological sites at time of contact, right? This is way things were before the Europeans came along and stopped and intermingled with the Native Americans and passed a lot of diseases to them. So there was a lot of activity. Oh, another trick. I can't use my pointer. Okay. Anybody have a pointer in their pocket? Not today. This is a map showing the area of interest for the Europeans, which is pretty much the land they could sail up to, close to the water, right? That's the blue area. And these other areas are areas that the Native Americans kept getting pushed westward out of. You notice up at the top there, when the blue pinches out, you see the Susquehanna River. The next river down shown on this map is the Patapsco River. There's 5 or 6 other rivers in there too. But what I thought was interesting about this map, it really doesn't show much action or much presence of the Native Americans in the whole area around us. It's an area that might have been used by other Native tribes, but not a lot right there. You see along the Susquehanna, there's lots of archaeological contact sites. Oh, now these two sheets are put together with the assistance of the leadership of current descendants of those Native Americans. And so I wanted something to look at, to hang my hat on when acknowledging and honoring the people that came before the Europeans. These people were here over 10,000 years. They probably migrated into North America 12 or 14,000 years ago as ice caps were melting and the water was rising. And all those Native Americans, a lot of them, encamped and had their towns and villages along the central channel of what is now the Chesapeake Bay. So this bay did not exist 12,000 years ago. It was just a continuation of the Susquehanna River down through Maryland and out over the continental shelf, because our oceans were 300 feet deeper at that point, because all that water was enclosed in ice caps on the planet. So, it would be a great kayak trip. You go up to Cooperstown, jump in at the head of the Susquehanna River, come down through Pennsylvania. That river continues right down through Maryland and out in the shelf. So it would be, at least a long weekend. Okay, so the Piscataway peoples, and they used the term peoples, not tribes or Native Americans. They chose that term. And they talk about areas of spheres of influence, geographic spheres of influence. Because a lot of this area wasn't necessarily owned by anybody. It was an area that was used by different tribes, and they had alliances. And I tell you what, over 12,000 years, those alliances and those names changed dramatically. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, go back. Okay, so down in this area, the Piscataway people are down here on the coastal plain material. Flat areas, certain types of crops were good down there, but they were not so much up through Howard County. Next slide. The Susquehannock Indian tribe is pretty much along the Susquehanna River in north, but they did use this area of Howard County and what I call the Piedmont as a place for hunting. So, I think each year we're learning more and more about how and what people did in that time. And certainly, even though Captain John Smith, when he came here and said, he saw these cathedral forests, well, guess what? Those cathedral forests hadn't been there 100 years earlier. When a lot of the Native Americans died off, a lot of the land, the trees came back and recovered. So it's a pretty interesting and complicated history. Okay, next one, please. Can you see those red lines on there? I did that very late at night. They're not exactly right, but roughly they're right. So what is this river bottom right here? The Patapsco, right? You can see it better than I can. Okay, and so the Patapsco River, at the mouth of it, is flooded by the bay as it came up. So instead of just a very narrow river, as things melted over the last 10,000 years, the water levels came up and made these mouths of these rivers estuaries. They flooded them. And so the Patapsco runs roughly through here, splits, one goes up and feeds and drains Liberty Reservoir. And then the other one goes west out towards Mount Airy. So that's what we all know probably most about. Flip over this side, we see another river that splits into two. One's the little Gunpowder Falls, and one's the big Gunpowder Falls. If you ever driven north on 95 from Baltimore, you're going right across that, and you see the signs, little big. And why I'm talking about that tonight is that that's my second most favorite rivers. I grew up on that river. So I have a different perspective on these two rivers, and I've learned a lot by trying to compare the two. I hope to share a little bit of that today. But that particular river feeds and drains Pretty Boy Reservoir and Loch Raven Reservoir before it goes into the Chocolate area. Okay, so a tale of two rivers. Next slide, please. Oh, we've seen this picture before. I made a mistake, I guess. I like that picture. It's a glorious picture. And I just wanted to use it as a way to say, yeah, I came for the beauty, the exercise, the peace of walking along a river. And I've done that the 40 years I've lived here. 40? Yeah, probably 45 years. Okay, what's interesting is my experience with this river is not just my own, but I have one daughter who went to school in Connecticut but came back because she got an internship one summer at Living Classrooms. Anybody know what Living Classrooms is? Okay, that's that nonprofit down on the Inner Harbor where they have lots of training programs, but they used to send people out to Howard County Conservancy for the farm or outdoor side of their program. And they engaged me for the summer down there 5 days a week, which is great. You know, she was an able-bodied seaman at the time, so they allowed her, run around the skipjacks and take people out. What was interesting to me is she and I were home by ourselves for a couple of weeks there, and we planned the summer that every Saturday morning we'd wake up early and walk or swim or do something in the Patapsco. And so we would go down at 8 or 9 in the morning to noon, come back, have lunch, and write in the afternoons. And I think that's where I started writing about natural history. I really hadn't done much of that before. But it was a great experience for a father-daughter when the daughter's a teenager. They get better, after that. We had a great time. Someday she'll publish hers. Another thing is FNT. FNT happens to be a woman named Frances, who just happens to be my grandmother. But she was, one of those women lib types about 100 years ago. And let's see, what part of that story should I tell? She had been a writer, editor of a woman's newspaper around 1900. She worked for the public relations of Public Service Electric and Gas up in New York City and Jersey when they consolidated 400 utilities. And she was the head of the PR program up there. So when my grandfather needed a man to run his public relations, he called up there and they said the best man we have is a woman. So he hired her, and she was good, I guess, but he married her about a year later. So her career didn't last very long after that. But what was interesting to me is that in those days, I've read her diaries, it's great. And in those days, she would say things like, Mr. Tillman and I took the trolley system out. He thinks the only way I can do my job correctly is if every Saturday he and I go out and take all the trolleys in the city out to the ends of the trolley tracks, which were things like the Electric Park and North Point and Ellicott City. So they would go to these places, and like North Point, they would fish and swim and eat and dance, evidently. But the one time we came out to Ellicott City, her last notes in the diary said, Mr. Tillman, after dinner, took me up to the tops of the hilltops, overlooking the quaint town of Ellicott City. And then she crushed out everything else. All we know is they got married shortly after that. Okay, so that kind of started triggering in my mind all the rich history in this area and how there's two ways to look at it. One is to be absolutely sure about all the facts and figures and times. The other is to take a look at all the facts and figures and times, but make it real. Make it, personalize it, humanize it. I mean, all these people, they were good and bad, right? But they can tell you a lot more if you consider using fiction to tell a story of history. So I want to know what it's like back then. Next slide, please. And I even bring in art, because an artist is trying to depict an area very accurately. And so this is probably typical around 1700 or so, where sail investors were critical for life, especially if expanding and trying to conquer the planet, right? And so that sometimes you'd be waiting for one of these tall ships to come in to bring you the materials you needed or to take your goods to market. So this is the essence of the market economy back in those days. And guess what? I like this scene over here all that muck from the oxen and the horses and the latrines just falling down into the river. But that was real. We didn't have good septic here in Ellicott City, what, in Noella, till about 20 years ago. But 100 years ago, it was a real mess. But it's also exciting to see a tall ship come in. So all of a sudden, I never thought of this area as being dramatic and exciting and neat and fulfilling, telling me what things were like. And you know what? I could be this guy right here. I could be a laborer. I could be a captain. There are a lot of longshoremen along here working this area. And having a job might have been good at that point. Yes?
How far up the river would those ships have gone?
At what scale? About this much? It depends on which one, but Elk Ridge is the main
Those big ships were
terminus.
able to get up to Elk Ridge.
They said 10 to 14 feet is what the typical river was near Elk Ridge. And they said that the largest ocean-going vessels could do that. Now, I've canoed through there, and it's not 14 feet deep now. But this gave me a feeling of life at that point, and I thought that was helpful. It's just like the stories here about walking Ellicott City, when it was all muck along the main road. Don't ask me what muck is. Next slide, please. And so transportation has really been key in the past, and certainly the age of wind and sailing was an important time to get here, right? Once you got here, you used to pull things. You had horses and oxen to move tobacco down to ports. The next big change, certainly for the Patapsco Valley, was the train system, B&O, as it went through that area. And you know what? That's a setting for some very good stories. Each one of these places, it might be, the business setting, it might be important for a family to support themselves, or a brokerage setting, all this stuff. I mean, what's in this car? It looks like a lot of coal to me. So wood was important, coal was important, oil. This was replaced by oil at some point. And it's amazing that that's still as active as it is, especially when we want to cut back on coal. Somebody else is still buying it from us. Okay, next slide, please. Have you all seen this map? I can get you the reference if you like, but it's a huge map of Baltimore that you can scale up and down. It's just wonderful for looking at the streets and the buildings that you might know. And so what's happening here? You have a lot of sail ships, but what are these guys? These are all steamships, right? And these steamships, dominated for like 100 years. Some of them went well into the 20th century. My father said he used to take the steamships up to New York, or up to Boston, up to Canada. It was faster than other options. So there was this displacement of one source of energy and movement to another. And it's a fascinating slide. I just love looking at it. And it is, it's Civil War or later, or more recent. But look what's happening up here on Pratt Street. That's light over there. Pratt goes across the top. You have these railroad cars being pulled by horses. Do you know the story behind that? Is that I got to figure out what's exactly right and what's kind of BS. That's what you had to do if you were going from the north to the south. You had to come down to Presidential Street Station, get off the train, and then get pulled by horses along Pratt Street to Camden Street Station. I think it's Camden Street. And I think the reason is they didn't want all those cinders blowing up in the city and burning down the city.
Wooden town.
That's right. And we ended up burning it down in 1904, 1906 or something, but that was supposed to be a cigarette. Anyhow, I thought that was pretty neat that you see that transportation going on. It looks like a dirt road, too. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just to show you the extent of man's development on the Patapsco River, these are the dams as recently as 1933. Now, we have far fewer dams today because we've been taking them out, which I think most of the people think is a good idea, but there was a lot of action. A lot of that was supported and encouraged because of the train system that goes up there, too, being a market deliverer. Next slide, please. So access to markets is very important. Okay, so just to try to summarize all the impacts, positive and negative, certainly not all, some of them. Tobacco was king initially. You got the best money for it. You can use it as money in some places. But it destroyed the quality of the soil. And so you had to do something different. You had to have a lot of amendments, change the rotation of crops. And so it got to be so unsuccessful that they needed free labor, right? And that's really encouraged the enslavement of people. This is a picture of the Susquehanna River. You see what that is? That's just logs. Millions of logs choking that river. And the river is, it's a pretty wide river. But we basically denuded trees in eastern North America several times over history. And we did that around here. Because guess what? When you start a furnace and a forge, grist mills, you need water, you need power. Where did that come from? It came from burning trees or charcoal, which takes even more trees. So we've done mass scale change to the area. Now we weren't the first ones to till the soils. Those Native Americans have been tilling it for hundreds and now thousands of years. A large swath of the Patapsco, you go down and take samples of the seedbed, and it shows that there were grasslands through that area. So they did burn down forests and cut down forests and change the composition of our forests to more beneficial trees, like more nut trees than others. And this is not very early on, but there's been a lot of mining and smelting and refinery of different metal ores in this area. My father's very involved with the copper industry. It was the largest copper smelter on the planet. And during the Second War, it had to increase by 5-fold to meet the demands of the war. And that was true of aluminum, iron, steel, all these different metals. And that was a major source of chemical pollution of the bay and the whole area, really. There's a lot of exhaust, a lot of dumping into the water, a lot of burial. So that was the way things were done back then. And again, it's like the old guy on the river. There was no problem with sewage from his outhouse if he was the only one in there. But once you get more people along that river, you got to start managing it. And that has cost us a lot of money because of the growth of population. Okay, next slide. I was going to lead up to this, and I can't do it. I think, Max, did you go on this trip? There was 6 of us got in kayaks one day and took off towards the bay from the Avalon area. I think it was like 6 hours or so. We went quite a ways. And at first, we were tooling along, paddling, and the water was moving us. It was a nice way to go kayaking is when you don't have to paddle, right? And we were saying, how beautiful it was. And we could see through the water down 2, 3, 4 feet. You could see yellow perch running upstream. It was idyllic. And then I was looking around and thinking, I've never seen a river this straight in my life. It's just boom, like this. And it was obviously compacted and redirected so you can have more land to build on. And the negative side of that, of course, just like the negative side of that other thing up in McKeldin, was that it doesn't slow down the river in a big flood stage. If it meanders, that takes the energy out of the river flow. And you saw that one map of the river. It's full of meanders, except where it's been changed. Anyhow, we were going down happy, think it's a great day to be out. And then we got to the Tidewater area. And in the Tidewater area, all of a sudden we saw about 10,000 plastic bottles floating in. And because, the tide's coming in, the current coming in, and so it goes back and forth. And, what's your first thought? Your first thought maybe is, boy, people around here are slobs. And then you realize all these plastic bottles came where usually came from, upstream. And, there's 350,000 of us in Howard County alone. That adds up pretty quickly if you lose one plastic bottle. I have to say that I made a pledge to myself that day, never to drink soda out of plastic bottles again. It's hard to keep that. Keep that. I mean, this is plastic, you know, but I've used it 400,000 times. But plastic's a big part of our life. Anyhow, I don't think I've contributed as much recently. And then look at those highways. You know, that's not a single train. That's not a single highway. That's just a melange of highways. Next slide, please. Okay. So we've seen some of the good, the bad, and the ugly. But one of the things we have done in Howard County, and Baltimore has done it too, but Harford County was slow to do it, and that's critical to the story. But Howard County got involved when, who were the people who did it? Joyce Kelly, George Reynolds, Jim Clark, and Jim Ecker got together and convinced the Brown sisters in their later years to let us work with their heirs to acquire this piece of property. It's now owned by the state and the county and Howard County Conservancy. But it's maintaining the whole Patapsco River. All these groups here help maintain the quality of the river. But this was a 232-acre piece of property, and it's preserved. It's a great demonstration site for all kinds of technologies. Next slide, please. And this is the picture of one of those preserved parcels, which is Mount Pleasant, where the Brown sisters lived. And it goes back 8 generations in the Brown family. And the plaques and the plat, I think, are around 1700, could be 1695 or something. I think Brown received it in 1703. Sometime after that, he wrote it down. But it reflects periods of financial well-being, you know, so they could add on to it. So I think there's a lot of history there. And it reminds me a lot of another one, Carla, which is the place I grew up in. It's a very similar story. It's, you know, the plat was from 1695. The log cabin in this case is on the left side, kind of behind that tree. It's a 2-story log cabin. The addition was added on, and it was 110 acres. What else do you notice about this picture? I would show you a real picture. It doesn't look much different, but this picture has more life in it. You know, it's a painting, it's a rendition of a place, by Kathy. But look, what have I done down here?
Hot lava.
There's no hot lava in Harford County. This is a picture that almost got burned up, right? So the inference is that something happened to this place. And the answer to that is that there was no available preservation options in Harford County at that time. And so you couldn't sell it to farmers. Oh, you haven't heard that part yet. We'll get to that in a second. But that's a prelude. Next slide, please. Homage to my parents. Next slide, please. Okay, so a couple of things here about that farm called Good Endeavour Farm. Is in the Depression era, they built these pens for raising turkeys, all 3 feet off the ground. That's how you did it. So they had 1,000 turkeys every year that they raised and killed. Let me tell you, that first year must have been a real battle between my mother and my father. And she came from suburbia. And killing and dressing 1,000 turkeys over Thanksgiving was, I think, a big issue. We raised sheep and hogs and beef cattle, and as well as the turkeys. Then what happened one day when I was about 12 is I-95 bored right through the center of the farm. Nothing we could do about it. It took about 40 acres, but we had a half a farm that was smellier, smoke, exhaust, and noisy, and all this other stuff. And Dad's pretty angry about all this, but his solution was, well, I'm going to hide all that. I'm going to plant 35,000 trees along that right of way, so I don't have to even see it anymore. which, didn't happen for about 5 or 10 years, right? Takes a long time for those trees to grow, but at least got his anger out, and he helped create a natural environment there for a while. The other thing, next to I-95, there's a 60-foot right-of-way that is where the 9-foot dimension, 9-foot, what's that, diameter occurred. And that's the auxiliary supply system for Baltimore City's water supply. And they've used it a couple of times, not many times. But I used to ride my bike up and down inside of that. And if anybody read my second book, you know that I was an eco-terrorist when I was 12, trying to stop I-95. It was, that's me. Isn't that vicious? When I found the dynamite, I decided I was in too deep over my head. Okay, so what did he do? He planted 35,000 trees. He had to thin them. He sold about 3,000 trees, which paid for my college education. So, you always have to have a cash crop on a farm. It went from turkeys at one point to Christmas trees. 2 men putting a tree on top of a van. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is all gone. And you'll learn a lot about that if you read the book. The book is a great setting for a lot of the stories that I felt I had to tell. Next slide, please. So anybody been up in Pretty Boy Dam, the reservoir? It's not that far away. It's beautiful. So we're going to run quickly, flow quickly down from Pennsylvania State Line down to the bay. Next slide, down to the port. Anybody been to Jerusalem Mill? Right here on the left. Jericho Covered Bridge on the right. Is there some sort of thing coming along here where I say Jericho and Jerusalem and Joppa? Joppa is a town in Holy in the Middle East. Jerusalem, Jericho. I don't know why they use those names right there, but it must have had some religious aspect to it. Next slide, please. And so as you come down, it's a very similar river in many ways to what the Patapsco is. But when it gets down to the port in Joppa, this was a major area of the port. And within 60 years of becoming the county seat of Baltimore County at that time, it was completely silted in. So it was the queen jewel of the northern part of the bay from about 1712 to 1768. All this tobacco going down rolling roads. We lived at the end of the rolling road. Bring it all down there. Tall ships would come in and take it away and provide merchandise to the local farmers. So that silted in. And what you're seeing is a lot of that happening in the background there. See all that lowland marsh area? And so it'd be very hard for you to walk across there, but it no longer was a place where tall ships could come in. So there was an old Joppa town, then it disappeared, basically. I used to hunt over in that area. And then in the 60s, Panets came in and built a suburb called Joppa Town. Doesn't look much like the old one. Next slide, please. And so all these yellow stuff here around Joppa has all been filled in just in our lifetime, not in our lifetimes, but throughout the 18th century. Next slide, please. But what's interesting about that part of the country is Good Endeavour, the name of the firm, is right on Old Philadelphia Road, which used to be called Philadelphia Road, or Post Road is in that area. So you have the Old Post, we now call it Old Post Road. And there's a lot of things happening historically with Lafayette and different armies going back and forth. Again, a fascinating history, just as it is. Next slide. And so the question is, what did I really learn by comparing these two? And as you see here, well, they're both Piedmont rivers, as long as many others are Piedmont rivers. And you think about that, the Piedmont is that uphill part from the fall line. East of the fall line, which is basically Route 1, things are much flatter. It's all sands and gravels and silts. West of the fall line is all igneous metamorphic rocks, which was the core of the old Appalachian Mountains, which shedded onto the eastern shore as the sands. And so the Piedmont rivers go across the fall zone, right? They're dropping tens of feet, which allows you to have power for running things. The Platts were both the same era, around 1700. They both had ports. I think Elk Ridge port probably lasted longer than the gunpowder port. But they were certainly dependent on the ports for growth of those areas. I kind of think of them, in fact, I remember this when Jim Clark took me to Mount Pleasant for the first time, that both of these houses were cabins on top of a hill. And you kind of wonder, sometimes you want to be near the water, but I think they wanted a view of everything to manage and keep an eye on things. They both had additions. They both probably used enslaved labor as well as indentured labor. There was much more enslaved labor going on here in Howard County, because of the type of farming, than there was in Harford County, which had a lot of indentured labor. But I think these people were instrumental in farming and building wealth in this country. Farming, digging wells, building additions on the houses. Many of them were quite talented, and we're a part of the workforce that created what we have today. So what I learned? Location, location, location. You don't want to be in the location where I-95 comes through. You don't want to be in a location where you don't think about what you're doing to the earth and you silt in your ports. I've heard that Elk Ridge Port also got silted in from some of the mining operations over here. And I found in reading all this stuff, they all had very similar challenges. Their personalities were, like yours, or like yours, like ours. The personality, basic personality types, I think existed back in time, which is one way to start looking at people like that. How did they exist? What challenges did they have? And what were the choices they made? Next slide, please. So what is the big deal, right? I mean, maybe you learned something about it, maybe not. But I came away from understanding those two areas thinking, I want to tell those people stories. I don't care if it's my father or great-great-great-grandfather. It could have been yours, But we have these little pieces of information. Not enough to make a complete picture and judge somebody by it, but enough to say, hey, if I can weave them together, I can tell this story for all of us. And so that was the fun part for me over the pandemic. Sure, I was struggling with some of these issues myself, but if I could tell a story that could inspire people to deal with those issues in a better way, I think we all would benefit. Next slide, please. So how can you tell it? There's a couple ways you can do it, right? You can certainly be a pure history and tell only the facts as best as they've been recorded, or you can create characters based on what we do know, and then breathe life into them. Next slide. I mean, why write a book? Well, this woman wrote a book in 1859. She's my great-grandmother's great-grandmother, something like that. And it doesn't mean anything what era there was, but the fact that a person existed that wrote down the family story of how they got kicked out of Ireland and had to come over here. It's a pretty neat story. And guess what? I thought I had the only copy in the universe a few years ago. But guess what? With Amazon now, you can just type these things in, and some cousin of mine, 55 times removed, had a copy of this, and now it's available. So why write a book? Well, the family farm was lost. And I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but many people have, where you've lived in a house for 5 or 10 or 50 years or whatever, and you leave it. You lose a lot of your memories. You lose all these touchstones. You try to take a few with you, but it's hard to do that. So when that house was torn down, we wanted to collect as much information as possible, tell those family stories, but not specifically to our family, just the concepts. Wanted to engage others and tell a bigger story about our past. Next slide. We can skip over this. This is just a list of a bunch of the stuff we had to look at. In fact, that's good. Don't go too fast. I mean, there's some neat things that we found, like vote for women, scarves, and ration cards, and guns and swords and uniforms, without any story attached. A lot of books. Next slide, please. This is my grandmother. This is her book, which I think is still relevant, about her life before coming to Maryland, where she had been an actress at 5 years old and traveled around the Midwest in the Rocky Mountains, performing with her family. So she had lost her mother at childbirth. Her aunts picked her up, trained her, and about 8 of them traveled all across, like Leadville and Butte, Montana, and Bisbee, all sorts of places. Okay, next slide, please. Here's a whole troop, and she's a young girl in the middle. Next slide, please. And this is what she grew up 70 years ago. And I hate looking at something like that. It's so confusing. But what's fascinating is some place where they give you one extra word, or 3 extra words, like died at sea, or did never return, or descended from such and such. All these little pieces, not enough to tell you enough, but enough to wet your whistle, so that maybe your family's history has something to offer as well. And so it's just really encourage you to think about that for yourselves. And notice my name's not even on there. I don't know why I'm showing it. Someplace down there. Okay, next slide. I don't even know what some of those are, but they were my ancestors. Have you ever calculated your ancestors? You have 2 parents and 4 grandparents. In 10 generations, that's over 1,000 people you descended from. What good does one person story? But everybody's stories make sense. Okay, next slide. Yeah, and we tell all kinds of stories, so we got to be careful with this. But I have to, give you a heads up that my mother always thought there was buried treasure on the farm. I hear that very clearly today.
Under I-95.
I won't say anything more about that. Next slide, please. Okay, so the challenges, very similar to what we face today. I mean, dying from a disease was so commonplace. Everybody expected to lose somebody in their families for long periods of time. Vigilante justice, or I should say injustice. I mean, it's like, that's always been here. We're so fortunate we still have a democracy over 400 years of fighting with each other. But maybe it says something about it too. Maybe there's some strength there that says it still can exist. Fact and fiction. Yeah, it's always a challenge to know the difference, right? And population growth, The 3 options we have in most cases in fixing the earth is try to decrease population growth, change all of our behaviors, or come up with some magic bullet. Which I think what's going to happen is we're coming up with hundreds of magic bullets, some of which will fire. For the water. But to me, understanding that history helps to put things in perspective. And I think that's something we all lose touch with sometimes. And certainly, people in 15, 20, 25, 30, don't have that experience, and they don't read history. They won't benefit from knowing that. So I would love to see every kid, before he graduates from high school, to read about this. Next slide. Yeah, the themes of tenacity, the people who made it, it was tough. Certainly in my family, all the women have been strong, no question about that. Love of the land, that's certainly very strong in lots of people. Importance of community, debate, and empathy. I think I have a couple of great sections in the book about how empathy solves the problem. And then we all have some good and evil in us. You always have to ask, what would we have done in their shoes? Next slide, please. So all I had to do after reading all that, researching all that, all I had to do was pick a genre, and I picked nonfiction, describe the setting where I lived in that house for many years. I knew where the creaky floor planks were, and that smell of wine that had exploded in the basement, you know, and the bats in the attic. You know, I could be very descriptive about that, which was fun. Create composite ancestors. I think that is very effective. Breathe life into the dormant names in a family tree. I hope I did that. That was my goal. Infuse them with personalities of people I knew, like Audrey. Liz is in it too. And then let the characters tell their own stories. So one pandemic and 3 years later, next slide. This book's available as of last week. Be happy to sign them for you. But it is based on a real place, based on real events. Mainly real events. Composites of people, and how people may have dealt with the moral issues of their time. Yes. So if you want to help out, you know, read the book, pass it on, give me a shout out when you can. Because I think it potentially, in my mind, is a very valuable book for us and for our next generations. And it's something you can get on Amazon or American Booksellers Association's independent place to buy books. Next slide. There's much we can learn from the past and from each other. So give it your best and let me know if I can help you. Thank you very much.
All right, so we do have some time for questions if anyone has some for Ned. Before we move on to that, I do just want to say thank you again for joining us for our 2023 Patapsco Days lecture series. If you enjoyed this series of talks, please be sure to keep an eye out for advertisements for our upcoming second annual Charles L. Wakeett Memorial Lecture, which will be held in May 2023. We're going to be having an upcoming scholar, Sophie Hess, give us a talk. I'm excited for you to hear about her research, so keep an eye out. We'll be posting about that soon. All right. On that note, if anyone has any questions for Ned, we have some time to address those. If not, please grab some snacks on the way out. That's less for me to have to load into the car. And then please check out Ned's book. There are some copies on sale in the back of the room. And then we also have some broader history books on the Patapsco that will be available as well.
If you're not already a member of Patapsco Heritage Greenway and you want to find out more about the organization,
Yes.
you can look us up at patapsco.org, and then you can search events if it's events you want to come to. But there are lots of other bits of information that might appeal to you on that website.
Yes.
And I'm going to say, if you're interested in hearing it tonight and you want to tell your friends and neighbors, he will be speaking on April 7th at the first Friday lecture of the month at the Museum of Hurricane History in Ellicott City. And he's going to address many of these same points about the writing.
I gotta write a whole new slideshow.
You can't show me that one.
You have 2 weeks.
But just keep in mind, you can check on our website, which is hchsmd.org, Howard County Historical Society, Maryland.org, and we're very much looking forward to hosting you. So, and our archives are upstairs, so if you are interested in local history,
But the talk is at the museum, the church.
The talk is at the museum at the top, not the top of Mount Misery, halfway up. And Mount Misery is actually the Caroline Hill. You know, Ellicott City has 7 hills and a Tiber River, just like one.
And that's
And
it.
the gate to the railroad tracks is still the width of a chariot drawn by 2 horses. Has not changed since ancient times.
I didn't know that.
There you go. That's why those horses work so well on the street.
And we're in the Patuxent River Valley here, but if you go to St. John's Lane-ish, then we're over in Patuxent.
I saw a few hands come up.
Do you think the planet is going to remain habitable?
For our lifetime, yeah.
Your crystal ball?
It seems like things keep getting worse, and we're not doing anything about it.
The answer to that question is different depending on age and my progress.
I'm glad you're a good thing.
Yeah. I don't think we're going to slow it down enough to prevent a lot of very difficult times. I think there's a lot of technologies that could help. We just got to do them. And I try to give kids hope, because all they can do is they've got to study harder, find something they're real good at, and apply sustainable logic to it to shift everything. We've tried, and we've accomplished a lot in 50 years about understanding chemicals and things like that. But
Our politicians don't seem to be doing a good job. They just want to fight with each other, and they're not accomplishing what they're elected to do. And that seems to me the main thing that politicians throughout the world should be working on, and it doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, it doesn't seem to be, but it all starts small. The Ellicotts came here, they were crying out in the wilderness, they built Ellicott City. Elon Musk cried out in the wilderness, and he's space stuff and electric car. So it all starts with a person.
And I think, looking back at what has changed in the last 5, 10, 15 years, there's a lot more acceptance and a lot more business trying to figure out the right solution.
People
And
are still driving these big SUVs with no electricity, or, I don't know, it just,
I made a list once of all the things I could think of I needed to do, with dozens of things, right? And then I had a place saying things I do, things I hope to do in the future, and things I probably never do. And it's a good exercise, first of all, because there are things that are very hard for each of us to do. So we all can't do the same things probably, but we need to do it. But we need a lot of help on the big picture side of things too.
And to be honest, Ned, anytime you do something, there's not always a positive impact. There can be a negative impact you haven't anticipated that changes something about that. So every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah.
So you have to give thought to that, and that's a whole school of action. But to be honest, even if we fall down, we're still going forward, so we need to keep going.
It's a tough time right now, but it's a lot better off to see the action than not the action. And groups like this, being part of it, or other groups, I mean, it's like groups make a difference. And we can help each other, as you say. It's gonna be tough. Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit on your Civil War surgeon relative? I'm curious, you don't have to tell us which side he fought on, but can you tell us which war he fought in?
He didn't fight on one side or the other, he just fixed one side.
Oh, okay. That's a good way to do a coordinate.
I don't know a lot more, except a description of the box of tools he took with him, which is pretty scary. Mainly was cutting off legs and arms, and giving people morphine. And you assume that many of those people were addicted themselves. This is such horrendous situations. And how they recover from that is one of the things I try to explore. But
Recovery, reconstruction in the book.
it's in the book.
It's in the book.
I mean, personal reconstruction, not talking about the whole north-south reconstruction.
Yeah, that's more to him.
Yeah,
His,
yeah.
recovery in a reconstruction, global sense. Okay.
Yeah, and again, you don't know what you would do in a situation like that, but
Yeah.
but you could try and think through that, and I think that's the value of how did this happen.
Do you know much about the founders of your family? Because you have 16 something or other to 2023, I believe. Do you know what the first people were in your family
That came?
Yeah, were they indentured servants, or were they the owners of?
Well, we're talking about
indentured servants?
1,024 different people,
Yeah,
going
right.
back to that point. So
Okay.
I don't know them all.
Well, I meant
The family name follows down through a
Tillman.
Tillman's
Okay.
that settled on the Chesapeake Bay
Where?
in 1634,
1634. Where?
James River.
Okay.
Charles City proper is right where their little.
Uh-huh.
Turned out they got some acreage when they came because they brought other people with them.
Right, exactly, yeah. They got 50 acres.
50 acres per person they brought and paid for a trip. But we went to find it one day,
Mhm.
and it's a whole swampy area, so I think they got hoodwinked, which I think was common. But they were better off than many.
Yes.
And I try to do that in the book, saying I'm not talking about the upper 1%.
Sure.
I'm talking about the lowest 1%. I'm talking about the one I'm probably most familiar with.
Right.
I'm not, I can't tell somebody else's story.
Right. Yeah, that's, you reflect on what you know.
Yeah. And hopefully I'm adding something of value by doing that.
Sure.
And not speculating.
Well, you're bringing it to light.
Yeah. Yes.
Ned, when you were researching your family tree, did you find those online websites at all helpful?
I have a cousin second cousin once removed, first cousin, who is really into that. And I can't get into it. I'll go sit down with her and read it. I don't like the bits and pieces, but I have no way of tying them together because, it's not just those 1,000 people you directly send from, it's all your brothers and sisters.
Right.
There's 100,000, and I don't know if that's any more important to me than having your story,
Yeah.
Makes it, Yes.
I love that it's your fourth book. I love this.
It's my last book.
Well, maybe that's right, what I wanted to ask.
Oh, I'm sorry.
2 nonfiction and then the 2 fiction.
Yes.
And I'm curious about how you discipline yourself to, how do you write? And are you outlining? Are you dreaming? What do you do with your drafts? How did you do it?
I'm probably a lousy example of that because I will not touch the paper between books because it's a very grueling process, right? Until 3 things align. It's got to be something I'm really interested in, know something about. I have to have a basic knowledge. It has to be something that is very relevant to the time. It's got to be something that's important to somebody else. It's got to have a marketplace. And it doesn't have to sell 1 million books, but if I can have some influence on the county or the state level, or maybe the national level, that would be great. So I usually sit down and write something, different. The last 2, I sat down and wrote out the story. And then I rewrote it 50 times, right? And in that process, I will go online and take a course, a couple-hour course, like dialogue or something, just to enhance the dialogue. It's that sort of iterative process. And then I call up my good friends and bug them to read it, right? So I will have alpha readers fairly early on, beta readers, and then kind of, at this stage, I need everybody to review it and rank it on Amazon, right? So, I try to get famous people to sign up. That's hard to do, right? So, but I do need, references like that to review it to make it catch up. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just piggybacking off of that, do you find you have a markedly different process or approach towards writing nonfiction versus historical fiction? Is it a similar process for you?
Well, in writing this one, I want to be very careful of the facts, right? I want the facts to be facts and the fiction to be fiction. And like creative nonfiction, sometimes that's hard to do. The easiest one to write, I think, was the one I wrote, starting with working with Lee, walking up the river valley and writing all these vignettes. All of us have little stories in our lives that are fun to try to write down and make them readable, make them exciting, make them interesting. And so I did that for 5 or 6 years before it was suggested to me to put together a natural history assessment of the Chesapeake Bay, sort of thing. A bunch of stories on it. Anybody else? Yes.
What's happened to the farm now? Is it
It's 328 houses.
Close to the, to 95?
Yeah, you can see it from 95. In fact, recently, last time I went up, they were cutting down the trees.
Oh.
No.
So the original building's not there?
There were 7 buildings on the property, 2 big barns and a house. I never been back until recently when I went back because of the book, trying to. And, you know, nobody there has any idea what the history is. Right? We move on.
Right.
So I'm going back and talking to those guys. I think it'd be fun for them. Yeah?
No family cemetery there?
No.